Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second Southeast Asia Biodiversity and Climate Change Policy Forum, delivering a triple win for climate, biodiversity, and rights. Policy frameworks for integrated approaches and environmental conservation and sustainable development. This event is hosted by the UP Law Center's Institute of International Legal Studies in partnership with Parabukas and is held in conjunction with the upcoming Southeast Asia regional rounds of the Stetson International Environmental Moot Court competition. I am attorney Alex Gamboa, an environmental lawyer and currently the manager of government initiatives of Rare Philippines, and I will be your host for today. This forum aims to raise awareness on nature based solutions, ecosystems based adaptation, and similar integrated approaches that can deliver outcomes for climate, biodiversity, and sustainable development. It also aims to generate robust discussions on international policy framework and regulations, as well as social and environmental safeguards on nature based solution, ecosystem based adaptation, and similar integrated approaches, and how these have been implemented. Today, we will be hearing from our esteemed group of speakers, namely Attorney Ping Peria, Professor Erin Okono, and Attorney Jane Corpus. This will be followed by a moderated discussion where we will be joined by our equally esteemed group of panelists, namely Attorney Roberto Cadiz, Professor Royal Gardner, Attorney Pocholo Labog, and Mr. Yeb Sanyo. After the event, for our competitors, please stay online for your orientation. This event is live via Zoom and simultaneously live streamed on Facebook. To welcome us all to this event, may I call on the director of the UP Law Center's Institute of International Legal Studies, Professor Romel Cases, for the opening remarks.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second Southeast Asia Biodiversity and Climate Change Policy Forum. As Director of the Institute of International Legal Studies, I welcome you to this webinar, and I'd like to express our appreciation to our partner, Parabukas, for making this webinar possible. We are very honored to see everyone here, and we are very grateful, especially for the presence of our guests who are all very busy individuals, but they have honored us with their presence today. I'd like to thank Commissioner Cadiz of the Commissioner of Human Rights, Professor Roy Gardner of Stetson University, Professor Erin Okuno, also of Stetson University, Mr. Nadarev Sanyo of Greenpeace Southeast Asia, Attorney Ping Peria of one of our negotiators to the UNFCCC and the CBD, Attorney Jennifer Tauli Corpus of NIATERO, Attorney Pocholo Labog of Business and Human Resources Center, and our host, Alex Gamboa of Rare Philippines. Now, this forum is meant to kick off this year's Stetson International Environmental Moot Court Competition, Southeast Asia Regional Rounds, or we call it SEER. The College of Law, again, is hosting this for the 8th consecutive year. The competition's preliminary rounds will begin tomorrow, and among our participants in this webinar today are the students coming from universities in Southeast Asia. The finals will be taking place on Friday, the 15th of January. Personally, hosting the SEER has been a great privilege for us here in the UP College of Law, not simply because the Stetson International Environmental Moot Court Competition is widely known to be the most prestigious international environmental moot court competition in the world. It's also because the SEER provides us with a unique opportunity for further learning, discussion, and participation of experts and practitioners alike, and allows us to foster cooperation with our Southeast Asian counterparts. The Southeast Asian Biodiversity and Climate Change Policy Forum was conceptualized with that all in mind. Last year, we examined the role of policy and cooperative action in relation to terrestrial and marine ecosystems, such as wetlands, mangrove forests, and seagrass areas, which provide valuable ecosystem services, but usually receive less attention, investments, and resources. This year, our focus is on policy frameworks for integrated approaches on environmental conservation and sustainable development. Recent reports have underscored the need for urgent and transformative actions to address the worsening crisis of climate change and biodiversity loss. Despite commitments to curb greenhouse gas emissions under the UNFCCC and Paris Agreement, the UNEP reports that countries pledged reductions as indicated in the NDCs may only limit warming to about 3% by the end of the century. This is far from the global target of well below 2 degrees Celsius pre-industrial levels, with efforts to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Um, the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity reports that a review of the International 2011 to 2020 Strategic Plan for Biodiversity shows that none of the 20 Aichi biodiversity targets have been fully achieved within the last decade. In addition, the adoption of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which was slated to take place last year, was postponed to this year due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The failure to meet climate change and biodiversity targets will have serious impacts on human communities. Worsening climate change, biodiversity loss, and ecosystems degradation are expected to undermine the progress towards meeting the SDGs, particularly those related to poverty, hunger, and health. Severe and widespread environmental destruction exacerbates underlying inequities as well, increasing the vulnerability of certain sectors and communities. The cross-cutting nature of these crises require comprehensive and holistic approaches that can deliver cross-cutting outcomes as well. Achieving climate, biodiversity, and sustainable development gains necessitates ambitious and collaborative action at the global, national, and local levels from all sectors of society. A number of integrated approaches have been developed, especially in recent years, with the objective of cutting across related areas of work and providing multiple benefits. A couple of examples of these approaches are ecosystems-based adaptation and nature-based solutions, which we will be hearing more about this morning. Concerns have been raised by advocates about certain approaches. These are fears that nature-based solutions, for instance, may put forward as substitutes for more progressive actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, address land use change, or absolve companies from liabilities arising from the destructive impacts of their operations. The implementation of these integrated approaches may vary widely, and with limited guidance, integrated approaches may fall short of what they were meant to accomplish. Today, as we discuss how integrated approaches can deliver outcomes for the biodiversity, climate, and sustainable development, we will be we will also be looking into how international policy frameworks and regulations have been implemented. Social and environmental safeguards for these integrated approaches will also be explored. We are very fortunate to have such an impressive array of speakers this morning, and we are very grateful to them for their willingness to share their time and expertise with all of us. We would like to welcome everyone once again and look forward to a fruitful morning for all. Magandang umaga po sa ating lahat.
Thank you so much for that opening remarks, Professor Cassis. To start us off with our discussion today, may I call on Attorney Ping Peria, who will be speaking about nature-based solutions in the ASEAN region. Attorney Peria is engaged in legal counseling, litigation, and legislative advisory services to clients based in Soxergen and occasionally in other parts of the Philippines as a practicing lawyer of Elpidio V. Peria Legal and Legislative Consultancy. Attorney Ping Peria also served as a negotiator and legal consultant of the Philippine delegation in several Conference of Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. Let us welcome Attorney Ping Peria.
Thank you, Alex, for the kind introduction, and thank you, Professor Rommel, for organizing this activity. So, of course, to Parabukas, my friends Aya, Alaya, and Niner for pulling me in. So now they asked me to discuss, no, what are these safeguards and these nature-based solutions, and how are they in the context of Southeast Asia. So I will be focusing on the questions that they have provided me. So, but before I start, let me post this picture. Next slide, please. Next slide. So because most of you I've been told are students, so I'd like to test your visual acuity. No? These two pieces of bamboo, are they nature-based solutions for what? For transporting people or transporting water? You'll know the answer later. Okay, now let me go to the next slide. The first question asked of me is, so how are nature-based solutions defined? Okay, can you gradually lay it out? So these are usually solutions that are next inspired and supported by nature, which are cost effective, simultaneously provide environmental, social, economic benefits, and help build resilience. And such solutions bring more and more diverse nature and blah blah blah. No, but the point of I would like to make here is: are we satisfied with this definition? You must remember your teachers in your English class. Don't use the same word when you define. Too bad. This is from the European Commission, one of the big regional grouping that is actively pushing for nature-based solutions in every arena that they are involved in. But if we go for the total essence of a thing as called for by Socrates or John Locke, what is the essence of nature-based solutions? And I've scrutinized most of the literature that have been proliferating, I think since 2015, though they have become more and more prevalent now. And I think the better way to guide you is to look at this next two slides. Next slide, please. So this one, it doesn't really provide a definition, but provides a good conceptual framing on what may be or how may we develop a definition for nature-based solutions. And as you can see, this is an FAO document recently came out in 2018. You can look at nature-based solutions as an intervention in ecosystems, and it can be from type 1, where there's no or minimal intervention, or type 2, partial intervention, or type 3, inclusive intervention in ecosystems. That has since been updated. Next slide, please. This one is also an EU-funded project. So you can see the EU really pushing hard on this. No? Nature-based solutions handbook. You can check out the references later. But they also applied the same typology. No? But this one, while the other one, the FAO document deals with the way to intervene, whether from zero or minimal to total. This one provides examples. So perhaps they just use a better set of terminology, but I think they also involve making use or better use of the ecosystems. So type 1, protection and conservation strategies in terrestrial, marine, and coastal areas. So it's good they provided examples to also clarify in your head how this NBS may actually be conceptualized and implemented. And then, of course, another one with partial intervention, what you need to do is to enhance the sustainability and multifunctionality of managed ecosystems. So this cuts across various ecosystems, no, from agriculture, coastal ecosystem, even urban ecosystem. And in my work with the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity, I think a lot of ASEAN member states have pushed hard, no? Particularly Singapore, in promoting urban biodiversity or biodiversity in an urban setting to really enhance the multifunctionality of managed ecosystems. And of course, also for the total inclusive or maybe coming up with an entirely new ecosystem from the ground up, that's type 3 NBS. No? So these are the examples that have been provided. So again, let's just say that a lot of work has been going on, but of course, next slide, please. No, what one thing that we need to take note is, you can use what you may want to do with it, no? But Indonesia, in its submission, no, this is Indonesia as a country, no, the leading country in Southeast Asia, put forward a submission to the UNFCCC because there will be, I think, is in the first quarter of this year, I've been told from the UNFCCC friends there. There will be a standing committee on finance, and standing committee on finance is one key UNFCCC body that will tackle, no? Of course, for the finance angle, what is NBS? This is Indonesia's submission, which they've been asking, no, that the forum should provide a definition that could clarify. So meaning, there's an admission that formally there's not yet an official or perhaps backed by the international processes on what NBS is. And in fact, even in the CBD, no, that's why Indonesia said there needs to be a criteria, no, to differentiate by NBS for biodiversity. So that's the what Indonesia is saying. Next slide, please. So I will be focusing on Southeast Asia-based organizations that put forward their thoughts on what NBS is, because actually in the literature, what you can notice, and you are lawyers, you should be mindful of who is talking about these things. These are mainly big organizations, international organizations, and there are very few developing country organizations that are really pushing hard for this. And in fact, in this next, can you plus out this next slide? So Tebteba is an international indigenous peoples organization in consultative status with the UN, ECOSOC. Tebteba, also in the same submission to the Standing Committee on Finance, said that maybe these definitions, perhaps there should be some caution, no? Because these are definitions that are written by big conservation entities, coalitions, and regional organizations. There's actually nothing wrong with them saying those things, putting forward these things like the EU. But I think from the perspective of rights holders and indigenous peoples and local communities, you have to be mindful. And of course, you are all lawyers based in the urban cities. You need also to be grounded based where the people are, and you need to know the perspectives. Maybe you have to look at it from your witnesses if you're going to put forward cases. You have to be mindful on how they look at it, on whether they understand the same thing as you are or as these organizations. Can you complete the this animation, please? And also, Tebteba look at the various proposed to look that the forum should look into the other elements, no? According to the perspectives of particularly the marginalized and most vulnerable sectors. And why do you think it's important? Because they are the ones that are currently affected. Uh, Perhaps it's just a matter of basic decency. Ask them whether they want really to be impacted in this manner with the solutions that being proposed. And in fact, one key issue that's raised by Tepteba is where there be a no-go zones or exclusion lists. This is from the experience of indigenous peoples, particularly in mining, no? Where in some areas have been set aside. And of course, as a defense, indigenous peoples would prefer that their areas of rich biodiversity would be off limits to mining. So putting it forward now to nature-based solutions, do you think some of this will be off limits? Of course, nature-based solutions and mining are an entirely different set of concepts. Next slide, please. So I will continue scrutinizing the definition so that somehow that will broaden you, especially when you go to the debate to dissect, no, what is really uh, a good definition of nature-based solutions, and you'll be find out that you have to consider a lot of considerations, including this one. Third World Network, by the way, is an international NGO, no, based in Malaysia, and most of it, of course, it presents the perspective of developing countries. Of course, opposite to what may be a typical developed country organization. And because we are here to discuss the context of Southeast Asia, this is what I am presenting. So to dissect nature-based solutions, these are some of the critical questions that Third World Network proposed. That this will be the Standing Committee and Finance Forum on NBS will tackle. So you can also use this in your moot court competition. So what are the solutions for? Whose problems are being solved? Who is profiting from the solution? Who put the carbon in the atmosphere in the first place, and who should be tasked to remove it, and other impacts and ownership and benefit sharing issue. You see, Third World Network is from the perspective that, from the developing country perspective, that uh, like that question of who put the carbon in the atmospheres in the atmosphere in the first place. So its perspective is that the group of countries that have the primary duty to remove carbons is on the developed countries. But of course, Paris Agreement erased that distinction because everyone now has to contribute to mitigate or reduce their emissions. Next slide, please. So we're still in the first question posed on the definition. I'll be continuing. The next question posed to me was, so how is it NBS defined under existing international frameworks and guidance documents? And for me, I'll focus on the Rio treaties. Though, of course, I look at WTO and even including UN WTO, World Tourism. No? They haven't really tackled nature-based solutions, except that the UN World Tourism Organization made references to nature-based solution, but in a think piece, no, it's a policy document. But in an international framework, of which it was agreed by the members of that body, if you go for UNFCCC, UNCCD, and UNCBD, I can confidently say, no, tell you that there's none. Of course, there are processes involved. UK is very much involved in the Edinburgh process. We are suspecting UK might push as a COP26 chair to come up with a document. But in a forum that we had with them, no, with ASEAN Center for Biodiversity, I think they are more focused on perhaps coming up with finance instruments, perhaps to promote nature-based solutions or something related to it. So there's none. No? I can tell you, I can even bet, no, with you on that there's none so far as of today. No? Okay, next slide. Next slide. But in the CBD, the CBD, before you go to the conference of the parties proper, there's a subsidiary body that reviews proposed CAP decisions. And this was in November 2019. No? We were there. Was part of the ACB delegation. Though this is a recommendation, and take note, it's a preambular paragraph. It's a warning sign. No? If text in a subsa recommendation is in bracket, then that proposed paragraph is not agreed. A party has put a bracket in it. It can be up for further discussion. But as per experience, even in CAP, everything starts from scratch. Those who have guts to bracket and have instructions from capital can very well bracket whatever comes up from substa going to CAP. That's talking from experience. So this one still unbracketed. You can always say, well, it's good. It's being mentioned, but it's not yet a CAP decision. It's just a substa recommendation. and it's a preambular paragraph. Take note, it's not an operative paragraph. I examined the preambular paragraph. At least in my examination, I haven't found an operative paragraph. Maybe they were testing the waters, the one who posed this, to see whether this can pass muster. And it's here. No? It's basically an explanation on the benefits of nature-based solutions with safeguards, whatever that may be. Next slide, please. But there's another document in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Professor Rommel referred to it in his opening remarks that we are supposed to have adopted this in Kunming in October 2021. But of course, everybody was afraid to go to China around that time. And even now, we're not even sure if the scheduled May 2021 COP might push through. We are awaiting word from the CBD Secretariat, though some are saying that this can be pushed maybe closer to the end of the last quarter of this year. We don't know, which is good because this will give us time, parties, observers, actually even the UP Law Center, or even you, students, if you're part of your delegation as legal advisors, as youth reps, or so advisors of international organizations, you can make statement to also try to make changes to this proposed target. This is updated zero draft, meaning it has not yet been finalized. So this is still up for negotiation. It can even be erased, that phraseology there. So next slide, please. So that's from the CBD perspective. Nothing is final. Everything is being worked on. And another document is from the Green Climate Fund. This was mentioned by Tebteba in its document in December 2020 that the Green Climate Fund is considering some sector guides and it's tackling nature-based solution as one of the guides to this how investments may be made. I think that's all for the international frameworks and guidance documents. I think let's go to the next question. Do we still have time? Anyway. So what about the UN definition? I think let's just flash it all because this is the one that started it all, and this is the definition that has been cited most often. And now that you're aware of the typology, the three typologies, you can very well say that somehow this definition absorbs of all the varieties of NBS that can happen. But I think the next question is the more important one. Next slide, please. So the more important thing to consider on whether that definition will contribute to meeting the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement, the CBD, and the SDGs, these are the things that we should be mindful of. Can you just put it now, please? It's important to have a serious, thorough, sustained, and coordinated implementation. So meaning you have to be clear what you're doing. You have to be serious, thorough. You have to cover all the bases on implementing it. It has to be sustained. It is not a one-off event, and it has to be coordinated at various levels: local, national, even global, and of course funding. So the UN IUCN definition is par for the course. Any good idea is welcome. It has just have to be these things: serious, thorough, sustained, and coordinated, and implemented with a lot of money. Now we'll go to examples. I think that's the last part of the question. And next. So now I'd like to ask the organizers to just flash the video. This is an example of a nature-based solution that has been implemented by Indonesia for quite some time. And you have a video for this. No? And I'll let the video explain what this is. It's just a 1 minute plus video. It's a mangrove rehabilitation project. Uh, I don't know if you still want to try to, because I think the video illustrates. But if we don't have enough time, that's okay. You know? Will the video work? How much time do I still have? Because if not, I can just skip that. So the video seems not to work. So anyway, just in your spare time, go to YouTube. I downloaded it there. It was referenced by Indonesia in submission to the UNFCCC for that SAF forum on NBS. So this is an official submission, and judging from the video, it is more or less successful in recovering the coastal part of the community that has been eroded, no, by constant flooding. Maybe let's just go to the next slide if the video will not work. This one, no? Again, we have this, well, you call it bias, but I would prefer that we cite examples from the indigenous peoples communities themselves. So I highlighted the example there from Myanmar. They call it Burma. They have sloping agricultural technology and wet paddy cultivation. In Malaysia, in the Bidayu Jagoy community, they did multi-cropping and rotational agriculture. And the Philippines, we have the Kalamian Tagbanwa doing some nature-based solutions to enhance the water management for the resources in Coron Island, especially in island communities where water is scarce. Water management is important, and they have also the Ikalahan. Ikalahan is an indigenous community in Nueva Vizcaya. They have this forest reserve that been doing examples of nature-based solutions. And in North Vietnam, no, the local communities there that have engaged in basically reporting, no, disaster risk reduction approaches. So there have been a lot of examples, and as the indigenous people will say, they've been doing it since time immemorial. So why is it's only being done now? Okay, next slide. I think I'll go for the last part of this is an addition because my title has some discussion of safeguards, but I think the questions perhaps imply that I will tackle it. So when you tackle safeguards for NBS, I think the important thing to do is to embed it in the definition, given that they're still not yet there, and what NBS is not can be these things like should not be an offset mechanism for fossil carbon, not as a means to achieve net zero to international carbon markets like Article 6 of Paris Agreement, and not shift the burden from non-nature-based mitigation and adaptation to nature-based adaptation. What Indonesia is saying in the TWN is saying is that nature-based solutions is good, but this should not be an excuse for doing actual action to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Because if you do nature-based solutions, it's like you are doing it indirectly, and I think that's what uh, NBS should be not, no, or should not be. And then as for the positive, this is my last slide. Last slide. I think just flash it all. What an NBS should be almost first and foremost protect the rights of marginalized communities, well, particularly youth, women, and indigenous peoples and local communities, enable the functioning of ecosystem services, enhance the adaptive capacity of communities exposed to natural hazards, promote sustainable resource use. And this one, because I'm a lawyer and I've tried using this in a case I handled here, I failed. The court has no idea what precautionary principle is. Too bad for the writ of Kalikasan rules. But I think if we are serious in making good safeguards for NBS, which should be serve as a basis for future claims for liability, such that when an entity is not serious in doing an honest to goodness NBS, then they should be held liable for it, no? Like being able to sue them for whatever specified or unspecified amount of damages. Thank you. I think that's all. I think we'll go for the question. So, can now we'll answer that question. Those two pieces of bamboo, they are for people, transporting people. It's in a community here in Sarangani. It's actually a small pond, no? Where it's actually subject of a case right now, and I'm assisting the priest. Next slide for a full picture. Next slide. See, that's how that is a small pond where one can take a bath. So I don't know how many chose transporting water, no? But this is a separate one. Anyway, I'll stop there. I don't know if I hope I did not run out your time. So thank you very much. So we're ready for your open forum maybe later. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Attorney Ping, for laying the context of what we mean when we talk about nature-based solutions. It is so important to realize that this type of solution applies to a whole range of ecosystems from forest to urban, really emphasizing the holistic quality of this approach. If you have any questions for Attorney Ping or any of our speakers or panelists, you may post your questions in the chat box, both for those in Zoom and those joining us via Facebook Live. Our next speaker, Professor Erin Okuno, will be speaking particularly on how nature-based solutions are applied to the coastal ecosystem. Professor Okuno is a licensed attorney currently working at the Stetson University College of Law as the Assistant Director of the Institute for Biodiversity Law and Policy. She assists with the Institute's environmental education and service activities. She is also engaged in environmental research on topics related to environmental law, biodiversity, wetlands, and endangered species. She co-authored several reports and publications for the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands of International Importance. Professor Okuno also serves as an advocacy skills trainer at Stetson Law, where she coaches teams of students to prepare them for moot court competitions. Let us welcome Professor Erin Okuno.
Thank you so much, Attorney Alex Gamboa. Can everyone see my slides and hear me? Hopefully so. If not, please let me know. First, Happy New Year. It's an honor to be part of this forum again this year. Last year, I had the privilege of visiting the University of the Philippines and participating in the forum and the Southeast Asian regional rounds of the Stetson International Environmental Moot Court Competition in person. I really wish that we could all be there together in person again, but I'm glad that the forum and the competition have been able to continue in a virtual space. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Professor Ramel Cassis, Attorney Cecilia Therese Niner Giao, Chester Tan, all of the speakers and participants, and everyone else who's helped to make this forum possible and who's helping with the competition this week. Thank you also to Attorney Ping Peria for your presentation. It was an excellent introduction to nature-based solutions, how we currently define them and how we should define them, and their role in Southeast Asia. I'm going to talk to you about coral reefs again. I love the ocean. It's my happy place, and I really enjoy recreational scuba diving. When I was in the Philippines last year, I was lucky enough to dive in southern Leyte and the Batangas. It was absolutely amazing. And all of the underwater photos from my presentation are from my dives in Honduras, Costa Rica, and the Philippines. Advance my slide. Here we go. Today, I'll talk to you about coastal nature-based solutions or nature-based defenses, generally focusing primarily on their potential uses to address climate change impacts, the importance of and threats to coral reefs, the potential role of coral reefs as nature-based solutions. I'll try to identify a few of the current challenges and talk about some potential or likely next steps. In terms of coastal protection, typically engineered or gray options are what have been used and what are frequently used. So for example, breakwaters, embankments, and seawalls. But engineered structures may have significant economic and environmental costs. Coastal ecosystems offer an important alternative as nature-based solutions and can be used for climate change mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. For example, mangroves, salt marshes, seagrass, coral reefs, oyster reefs, dunes, and other coastal habitats can attenuate waves, stabilize sediments, and help with storm surge and erosion. And mangroves, of course, also provide important carbon storage. According to a synthesis from 2019 from Stetson et al., it was published by IUCN and the University of Oxford, at least 2/3 of the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions commitments under the Paris Agreement, include some type of nature-based solution for climate change mitigation and/or adaptation. And people are increasingly looking to the coasts and highlighting the coasts as a first line of defense. The potential of nature-based solutions to protect coasts is being increasingly recognized, and projects have been implemented. According to that same synthesis, at least 45 countries' NDCs include nature-based solutions for adaptation in coastal and marine habitats specifically. Based on my quick review of some of the NDCs, several of the member states in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations note nature-based solutions or ecosystem-based adaptation in their NDCs. But according to a piece from Stetson et al. That was published in 2020, unfortunately, there are few measurable targets in the NDCs with respect to nature-based solutions. There also are fewer studies on the effectiveness of coastal nature-based solutions compared to other ecosystems like forests. There are, however, projects that have employed coastal ecosystems as nature-based solutions, and I'd like to highlight a few examples. In Vietnam, there was a community-based mangrove reforestation, and disaster preparedness program. The footprint of that project is almost 9,000 hectares of mangroves, and members of the community helped plant those. They found that the coastal protection benefits far outweighed the costs of the project, and it reduced disaster risk, enhanced local livelihoods, and helped with carbon absorption. Another example comes from Kutubdia Island off Bangladesh, where they constructed 3 breakwater oyster reefs. They found that the oyster reefs dissipated wave energy, and there was around a 50% erosion reduction rate compared to the controlled sites. They also found that the salt marsh expanded seaward, which was a positive thing. Another example of oyster reefs comes from Florida, from a place that is not far from Stetson Law, the MacDill Air Force Base. And they've used oyster reefs to help with shoreline erosion and enhance habitat for mangroves. The final example, while I'm still talking about coastal nature-based solutions generally, is one from the Netherlands. They had what is called the Delftland Sand Engine or sand motor for climate change adaptation. The goals were to preserve and protect the coasts against flooding, sea level rise, and storm surges. So they created this large artificial peninsula with a huge deposit of extracted sand, and then let natural processes like wind and currents spread the sand out over time. And they have found that that has helped promote natural dune growth and has created new landscapes and habitat for plants and animals. So looking at these and other studies, the benefits broadly of coastal nature-based solutions are that they may be lower cost. Some studies suggest perhaps up to 5 times less expensive than engineered solutions. They offer comparable or greater benefits, and they may be more resilient than engineered approaches because ecosystems, under the right circumstances, can adapt, repair, and regenerate. Now I'm going to focus in on coral reefs. Coral reefs, sometimes referred to as the rainforests of the sea. It's a crucial, beautiful ecosystem, and it is home to over 1 million species. So over around 25 to 30% of marine species, but it covers just a tiny percentage of the ocean surface. There are hundreds of species of coral. The Coral Triangle, which of course includes the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and Timor-Leste, has the highest diversity of reef fish and coral, and Southeast Asia has around 30% of the world's coral reefs. Importantly, coral reefs are included in the definition of wetlands under the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands of International Importance. And Professor Roy Gardner will talk to you more about the Ramsar Convention later in the forum. Sadly, coral reefs are one of the most threatened vulnerable ecosystems in the world. The recent international assessments paint a very dark picture for reefs, including the IFBES Global Assessment and the Global Wetland Outlook. The Global Wetland Outlook noted that the Coral Triangle is one of the regions with the highest proportions of coral that have a high risk of extinction. And of course, the climate change projections from the IPCC report for coral reefs are quite bleak. These losses are alarming because reefs are really important. Of course, they have inherent value as ecosystems and as part of biodiversity, but they also provide numerous ecosystem services that benefit humans and the environment. To name just a few: food, they support biodiversity and fisheries, they protect against erosion and natural hazards like storms, they provide jobs, tourism opportunities, recreational opportunities, nutrient cycling, the list goes on and on. Billions of dollars of ecosystem services are generated from reefs each year. Reef tourism alone has been estimated to be worth at least $35 billion globally every year, and that may actually be a conservative estimate. Unfortunately, despite their value, they face many threats. It's a particularly sensitive ecosystem, and threats come at it from pretty much every angle, including pollution, overuse and overexploitation, overfishing and destructive fishing practices, unsustainable development, predatory or invasive species. So the picture on the bottom left here is a crown of thorns starfish. I took a picture of it because I thought it was neat looking. It's very problematic for reefs though. Tourism, mangrove and other coastal deforestation, dredging, land use changes, physical damage. And then of course, on top of all of that, we have climate change impacts that are adversely affecting coral reefs, such as increasing ocean temperatures, sea level rise, bleaching, and ocean acidification. And these threats all interact and compound and reinforce the adverse effects on reefs. This is an image from Huff Goldberg et al. It just shows how the global threats caused by climate change on the left of the screen negatively impact coral reefs in the middle, and then that has a negative impact on the ecosystem services provided by reefs. Looking at coral reefs as potential nature-based solutions, they have a lot of potential to address threats to coastal zones caused by climate change and other factors. Coral reefs attenuate wave energy, reduce wave height, and reduce flooding, sea level rise, erosion, and storm damage. There are quite a few examples of projects for coral reef conservation, but currently there are very few examples of coral reef projects that have been implemented specifically for risk reduction or coastal protection. I see a comment that my slides might not be changing. I have a slide right now that says coral reefs says NBS at the top. Goals, examples, results, other benefits. Excellent. All right, so we are all on the same page. All right, so as I was saying, there are quite a few examples of projects for coral reef conservation for ecological benefits, but there are very few examples of coral reef projects that have been implemented specifically for risk reduction or coastal protection. There have, however, been studies that assess the potential of coral reefs for risk reduction as a nature-based solution, including ecosystem-based adaptation. Ferrario et al. In 2014 found that reefs reduce wave energy by an average of 97%. They dissipate wave energy and decrease wave height. They offer similar or greater benefits than artificial structures, and they also may have lower maintenance costs because they may be able to repair themselves or regenerate under the right conditions. The authors estimated that around 100 to 200 million people could benefit from risk reduction benefits associated with coral reefs. And the top 3 countries included Indonesia and the Philippines. The United States was 5th. Narayan et al. In 2016 noted that coral reefs have the greatest potential to protect coasts out of all the coastal habitats that they studied, and that the costs of using reefs as nature-based solutions may be higher, though, and more variable than marshes and mangroves. Finally, Beck et al. In 2018 estimated the annual flood protection benefits from reefs for coastal protection. They found that the annual damages would more than double without coral reefs. They also found that reefs and other coastal habitats offer cost-effective solutions when compared with engineered approaches. And they too generated a list of countries. These are countries for which reefs provide the most flood protection benefits in terms of annual damages averted or avoided. First was Indonesia, second was the Philippines, third was Malaysia, and 8th was the United States. I also wanted to highlight a couple of projects. So Project Regenerate in the Maldives, they're working to develop and implement policies to manage and protect coral reefs, specifically to strengthen climate change resilience, adaptation, and mitigation in the Maldives. And their plan is that they will establish a sort of resilience-based management framework. Reguero et al. In 2018 designed a reef restoration project in Grenada specifically for risk reduction. It was just a pilot project. They installed 4 units and local community members helped them with the construction. They set up an artificial reef to help reduce erosion, and the early results showed good recruitment of corals. These and other studies suggest that there's significant potential for coral reefs as nature-based solutions, but currently we're lacking an evidence base and data. I also wanted to note the other benefits that are associated with these types of projects. So the ecosystem services provided by reefs are sort of co-benefits that come along. So these types of projects, whether it's restoration or protection, these or management actions, these also help biodiversity, tourism, fisheries, recreation, they create jobs. With engineered or gray structures or approaches, however, you often lose the ecosystem services. So reefs as a nature-based solution have these additional benefits that should hopefully elevate their profile. This picture right here is from a dive that I did last year while I was in the Philippines, and it has a frogfish in it, which is a pretty fun thing to see when you're diving. So I don't know if you can see him. He's right there. So that was really exciting and was really hard to find underwater. All right, current challenges. Right now, reefs are underutilized and underappreciated as potential nature-based solutions to address climate change issues. This is largely because there is a lack of evidence in terms of data, projects, and studies. This was a recurring theme across the literature when I was doing my research. As a result, there's a lack of policies and guidance on using reefs and other coastal ecosystems in this capacity. There are design challenges for coral reefs because they're underwater and there are many variables involved. Costs, as Attorney Perea noted, these projects can be really expensive. With reefs, they can be variable based on what I've seen so far, and they can also be expensive upfront. And then mostly these projects have been pretty small scale, so there's a need to scale them up. Looking forward at possible or likely next steps, lots of potential, lots of opportunity. We have to engage with and help policymakers understand the potential value of coral reefs and other coastal ecosystems for climate change mitigation and adaptation. For reefs, it's less apparent than some ecosystems because, again, they're underwater. So with mangrove projects, you can see the effects. But with reefs, it's harder to sort of understand in a meaningful way because we don't see them on a daily basis. We need to build the evidence base through additional projects, assessments, case studies, and comparisons so that we have the evidence and the data to help set targets, generate guidance, set policy goals, plan, implement, and manage projects. Some of the current data gaps that have been identified in the literature include more information on the effectiveness and cost effectiveness of these projects, comparisons to engineered alternatives, measurements of the potential benefits during extreme events like hurricanes, figuring out a way to quantify and estimate the risk reduction value of these projects, determine what they're going to be like long-term, what's the long-term sustainability, resilience. Management and monitoring needs and costs also need to be assessed. We need to try to figure out how to incentivize these projects. Of course, funding, thinking about grants and loans, trying to increase the scale, as Attorney Ping Perea noted, involving local communities and indigenous peoples. These are the people who are going to help implement these projects and likely are going to be the ones who monitor and manage them long-term. So they need to be involved throughout the process. Think about using private-public partnerships, plan and work holistically. So we have multiple scales, multiple sectors involved. These projects can have multiple objectives beyond just climate change mitigation or adaptation or resilience. They also can involve multiple ecosystems. It doesn't have to be just coral reefs. We also need to think about combined approaches with gray or engineered approaches. So nature-based solutions are not always going to be the answer. They aren't going to work on their own in every circumstance. So sometimes engineered approaches will be necessary, and we want to combine them. We should think long-term and be creative. And so I'll end with sort of two interesting examples. The government of Quintana Roo in Mexico bought parametric insurance for a section of the Mesoamerican coral reef. It was the first insurance policy for a coral reef, and they purchased it in 2019. It was part of a larger public-private collaboration. They established a coastal zone management trust and used funds from that trust to purchase the insurance. It already has paid out. The insurance policy has already made a payout in 2020 for around $800,000 after a hurricane. Another example, that was an example of sort of direct insurance. And another example of a sort of a proposed mechanism comes from Ruggiero et al. From 2020. They proposed a resilience insurance mechanism that combines a risk reduction, nature-based risk reduction with insurance protection. And so a restoration or some sort of risk reduction project is implemented. The risk reduction reduces the premiums for the insurance, the annual premiums, and then the savings from those premiums can be used to help offset the costs of the restoration or management project. And they propose that that type of mechanism could help scale up projects for reefs and other types of nature-based solutions. We need to work towards greater inclusion of and measurable targets for nature-based solutions, including coral reefs, so that we can try to meet our commitments and goals under international agreements and frameworks, working towards the SDGs, the Paris Agreement, the World Heritage Convention, Ramsar Convention, and others. We have to work together to find ways to help communities and governments at all levels embrace coastal nature-based solutions, including coral reefs, as an additional and potentially really valuable tool to mitigate and adapt to climate change. Thank you so much for your time and for inviting me to participate today. I look forward to the other presentations in the forum. Best of luck to the teams who are competing in SEER this week. And I hope to see all of you in person one day, and hopefully that will be very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Erin, for explaining how these kinds of solutions apply to the coral ecosystem, which is crucial, especially to Southeast Asia, considering that majority of the coral triangle is found in this region. We certainly miss seeing you here in the Philippines, and hopefully we'll see you back here in the near future. For our next speaker, we will be listening to Attorney Jing Corpus on policy perspectives and integrated approaches for climate change and biodiversity. Attorney Jennifer Tauli Corpus, or Attorney Jing, is from the Kakanae Igorot people of Mountain Province in the Philippines through her mother's side. Attorney Jing is a lawyer by profession and is currently the Global Policy and Advocacy Lead for NIATERO, a US-based foundation that works alongside indigenous peoples to secure their guardianship of important ecosystems. From 2005 to 2018, she was part of TEBA, Indigenous Peoples International Center for Policy Research and Education, most recently coordinator of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights and Policy Advocacy Program. Attorney Jing earned her Bachelor of Laws from the UP College of Law and her Master of Laws from the Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy program of the University of Arizona at Tucson, Arizona. She was the 2012 Indigenous Intellectual Property Fellow at the World Intellectual Property Organization, and since then has been an active participant in the WIPO IGC negotiations on the protection of traditional knowledge. She was also involved as negotiator and expert for the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, representing indigenous peoples at the negotiations leading to the adoption of the Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing under the Convention on Biological Diversity. Attorney Jane, go ahead.
Thanks very much, Attorney Alex. And I guess Chester will be sharing the slides from your end. Okay. Um, while we are waiting for the slides, I just wanted to run you through. But first, thanks very much for inviting me to this forum. It's my first time participating, and I didn't realize that most of the participants would be students. Okay. Now, and I apologize if my internet becomes unstable from time to time. I am based in the outskirts of Baguio City, and we only recently had an wired Wi-Fi fiber internet connection. Okay, do today the global context of indigenous peoples and local communities. Um, Talk about some of the impacts that environmental initiatives and development programs have had on indigenous peoples, and also walk you through some of the current studies and assessments, as well as proposals in relation to nature-based solutions in the climate change. Then I wanted to also to sort of point out some potential risks to indigenous peoples of some of these proposals. And finally, because the presentation is policy options, to make sure that nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based approaches to climate change adaptation and mitigation are done in a way that does not impact negatively on the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. So next slide, please. And of course, I'd like to thank all the previous speakers, including Professor Cassis, Attorney Ping Peria, and Professor Okuno, because now, well, they've provided concrete examples of nature-based solutions, as well as the definition of nature-based solutions, and a preview of the international legal discourse around these concepts, so that I don't need to do that in my presentation. Okay, some of the questions that the organizers have asked me to address are: next, what are the impacts? And then the next one, how can multilateral processes um, uh, be carried out while respecting the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities? So next slide. Okay, what is the situation globally? Indigenous peoples' land found everywhere. Okay, so this is from Landmark, which is an organization that monitors tenured and customary indigenous lands all over the world. Next, please. And they found that global recognized and unrecognized indigenous lands comprise 12%, at least 12.4% of the global land. This is not a complete study, and I'll show you some of the recent studies that have been conducted. But this is to say that most of and you'll see in the succeeding slides that most indigenous lands are actually hosts to forest-rich and biodiversity-rich areas. Next slide, please. And specifically for the Philippines, this is one slide that I'm very fond of showing, because it very clearly shows the overlaps between forest areas, biodiversity areas, and indigenous peoples' territories, lands and territories. So if you press the next button there, you are going to see that in the Philippines, this is the remaining forest cover as of 2004. It has changed, obviously, but let's use this for now for illustrative purposes. Next, press the next button, please. And these are the key biodiversity areas, and it's not surprising that you find them mostly in the forested areas, but also in very important coastal and marine areas as well. Next, next. And then obviously, where you find key biodiversity areas, the government endeavors to protect it through the National Integrated Protected Area System. So legislation has been put in place protecting some of these key biodiversity areas. And finally, next. And you see that there is also significant overlap between these forested areas, key biodiversity areas, and indigenous peoples' ancestral domains or indigenous territories. Okay. And this is why indigenous peoples are key stakeholders and or rights holders in any discussion that has to do with um, conserving carbon and also protecting biodiversity. So globally, this is a very recent study, 2018, from Garnett and et al., that shows the global distribution of indigenous peoples. And as I said, it's actually quite a lot bigger than the documentation that Landmark has. And the intensity of the color here indicates the strength of the tenure of indigenous peoples in the area. But the point that I wanted to show is that they are distributed quite well, widely, and that these areas are also overlapping significantly with forested and biodiverse areas. Therefore, this, again, as I said earlier, is a strong basis for including indigenous peoples and local communities in the discourse around climate and biodiversity. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Okay, this is also from the same study, but it identifies the percentage of indigenous peoples' lands that are also protected areas, and the intensity of color is means a higher percentage of overlap. Okay. Other lands, you can see it's a very light color. The percentage of other lands, in other words, non-indigenous lands that are protected areas, it's very light in intensity. As I said, there's a very low overlap. And then that last picture to the right, you have percentage of protected areas that are indigenous people's lands. And again, you see that intensity of color, which means that indeed, indigenous peoples are key players, and their lands, indigenous lands, as well as management, resource management practices need to be taken into account in any discussion around nature-based solutions. Okay, so next. Okay. And again, this is just a graphical representation, so I'm not going to go through it. Next, please. Okay. Given this impact, this overlap, what has been the past experience of indigenous peoples when environmental initiatives and development programs are carried out? In general, because when it was recognized that it was very important to protect certain areas of land in order to ensure biodiversity protection as well as climate change mitigation. The original concept of land protection was incompatible with human presence. Therefore, under the Convention on Biological Diversity, we had this concept of fortress conservation or wilderness, wherein the prevailing concept was that in order to protect an area and the species and the forests, the forest cover and the carbon within that area, you had to remove the people Okay, so the experience of indigenous people so far has been of displacement. Okay, next. And displacement has to do with physical displacement. So they have been evicted, and this is very, very evident in Africa, but also experienced here in Asia. There's a displacement from governance. So here in the Philippines, there are provisions in the law that allow indigenous peoples and other tenured migrants to continue staying within areas that have been declared as protected areas. However, there has been displacement in terms of governance because governance has now been transferred into government entities and the protected area management boards. While there are provisions that allow indigenous peoples to be part of it, they are in sometimes just one person, so in a minority position. Next. And then you have cultural displacement as well, because when indigenous peoples are very nature based, um, a lot of their lifestyles are very closely linked with their ability to access different parts of their area and their resources. So when they are prevented from doing this by, for example, declaration of certain core zones within protected areas, which means that there are no humans are not allowed in those areas, then this results in cultural displacement for indigenous peoples. So next, please. And then, of course, we have disempowerment, which is related to displacement from the ability to govern the areas. Next, please. And of course, environmental impact. And there are lots of documented cases, particularly here in the Cordillera, where if um, governance is taken away from the indigenous people, it then becomes regarded as open access. Um, and therefore, indigenous other people, not just indigenous peoples, other people can then enter the area and occupy it, since it is viewed as public land or land administered by the government. So there has been some environmental impact by the displacement and disempowerment of indigenous peoples from these indigenous territories. Okay, so I have 10, I guess 7 minutes remaining. Next slide. So I go to the second part of the presentation. Next. Okay, so I show you the same map. Next. Forest cover. Next. Key biodiversity areas. Next. Protected areas. And finally, the threats. So why are indigenous peoples important to be included in the discourse? Because there are threats and there's a recognized need to be protecting these forested areas and biodiversity rich areas from all of the threats that are posed by mining, for example, land conversion for agriculture and other threats that have been identified in global assessments. Okay, so next, please. Okay. So under the climate change discourse, as mentioned by Professor Cassis and Attorney Ping Peria, you have the Paris Agreement that asks for nationally determined contributions. Under the CBD negotiations so far, there are proposals for transformative change in the next strategic plan of the Convention on Biological Diversity. There are proposals to increase the coverage of protected areas from 17% terrestrial and 10% marine to 30% or even 50% protection. Okay? And these can be achieved through nature-based solutions, as Attorney Peria showed in one of the targets in the zero draft of the new global biodiversity framework, and also in ecosystem-based approaches. Now, what are the concerns that indigenous peoples have identified? And again, Attorney Ping has already identified some of these. First is leakage. How do you make sure that prevention of, for example, deforestation in one area doesn't just end up being transferred in another area? Or how do you make sure that that prevention of deforestation in one area doesn't end up transforming the form of the forest into one that does not support the richness of biodiversity. So that, for example, transforming virgin forests into production forests, such as tree farms. Okay, so that's a problem of leakage. Next. Then you have additionality and perverse incentives. So the way that some of these solutions, such as RED Plus, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, for example, which is being proposed as a nature-based solution. How do you make sure that they don't end up providing perverse incentives or incentivizing the polluters? Um, and an example is that in coming up with a regime for measurement um, of well measurement of avoided deforestation and avoided carbon emissions, um, you're required to identify your baseline and then identify what would happen if you continue with business as usual. So now incentives are provided in order for the curve to be altered. So those who are deforesting would now have some incentive to stop their deforestation activities. So the question now in relation to indigenous peoples is, how do you incentivize something that indigenous peoples have been doing since time immemorial, or sustainable forest management? Okay. And how do you now avoid giving incentives, for example, to um, the oil rich nations who are talking about, you know, um, wanting to be incentivized for not digging up the oil and emitting carbon. So there's this um, potential problem around nature-based solutions. The next, and then you have problems around measuring and monitoring, which is very technical. How do you involve the communities in doing this? And how do you see the forest, um, let me go through that in the next point. Next, please. And then, okay, let me explain the point that I tried to make earlier here. Greenwashing, which Attorney Peria has already alluded to. How do you make sure that carbon is reduced at source as well as in other places? So, how do you avoid nature based solutions from being a tool that allows carbon emitters to continue emitting by um, providing funds for carbon sequestering activities that happen elsewhere? Okay, there have been abundant studies that say that offsetting and net zero models alone cannot get us to where we want to be in terms of climate change and biodiversity. Okay, next. And how do we avoid displacement of indigenous peoples and other rights violations? And Attorney Ping again had some proposals for this, which is the implementation and putting in place of safeguards. Okay, so next slide. I think I have how many minutes? Have I run out of time? 1 minute. Okay, I'm going to wrap up now. And this is just a picture that shows us how indigenous peoples are nature-based. Next. Okay. Many indigenous people still live close to nature. And then next. This is an example from my hometown. We live within nature, and we have very, very well identified and delineated uses of the different resources and the different areas within our communities that are very, very nature-based. Next. And as I said, this has begun to be recognized by many different entities, such as the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which conducted a global assessment that showed that indigenous peoples have a very big role in achieving the goals of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Next. There's also this study, which is called the Opportunity Framework, that makes the argument that in order for countries to be successful in reaching their Paris Agreement commitments, they have to consider tenure reforms and funding in order to help indigenous people secure tenure over their land so that they would be better able to protect the biodiversity and the forest cover or carbon within their territories. Next. And there is Local Biodiversity Outlooks, the second edition, which carried out a study that said that although the CBD, Biodiversity Convention, is likely to meet its targets in relation to coverage of protected areas, the representativeness and equity aspects will not be met, and it would be a major missed opportunity if the role of indigenous peoples was not enshrined in the next strategic plan of the Biodiversity Convention. The next. And then I just put this here, just continue clicking, to point out that there are already existing safeguards. So the World Bank that administers the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility and the Forest Investment Program has safeguards in relation to indigenous peoples. Next, please. So there are already existing safeguards that requires any entity that seeks to carry out nature-based solutions or EBA in indigenous territory, it requires them to undergo free, prior, and informed consent. So next, please. And it's the same, next slide, for the Asian Development Bank and also for the Green Climate Fund, which is funding projects in relation to climate change. Next, and this is my last slide. So how can environmental agreements support integrated approaches? And these are my thoughts around policy proposals. So just continue clicking. And this echoes basically what the previous two speakers have said. It's important that recognition of the existence of indigenous peoples and respect for their rights are put in place, including their land and territorial rights, their right to consent or to have a say in all of these projects that could potentially affect their lands and their rights. Their governance and management of resources must also be put in as a central element of nature-based solutions, as well as the governance. As I said, there are already safeguards in place. These need to be re-echoed and strengthened in national legal frameworks and implemented. And it's not just about recognition of rights, but also recognizing that indigenous peoples have a role in carrying out nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based approaches. And this has been recognized by many countries, such as Canada, who have tapped indigenous peoples in monitoring the changes to the environment and also in protecting the land and the resources through their guardian programs. There are also examples all over the world, such as from Australia and from the Philippines. But what's important is that we have a mix of approaches wherein we make sure that all of these nature-based solutions compel those who are adversely affecting the environment to address the problem at its source, and also possibly have some sort of model where funds are provided in order for people in other parts of the world to contribute their share for protecting biodiversity and addressing climate change. So that's my last slide, and those are some of my proposals. I apologize for going over time, and I look forward to the questions in the open forum, and also to the presentations of the next panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Attorney Jane. We will be jumping to the panel immediately so that we have more time for the discussion. For this next portion of our webinar, we will be joined by our 4 panelists who will be reacting to what our speakers have discussed today. Our first panelist is Professor Royal Gardner. Professor Gardner is currently working at the Stetson University College of Law as a professor and as the director of the Institute for Biodiversity Law and Policy at Stetson's University College of Law since 2005. As director, he is responsible for coordinating education, research, and service activities related to biodiversity issues. He is also the co-founder and co-director of the Stetson International Environmental Moot Court Competition. In addition, Professor Gardner has been a member of the Board of Managing Editors at the Journal of International Wildlife Law and Policy and of the editorial board at the Wetlands Ecology and Management since 2006. He also served as chair of the Ramsar Scientific and Technical Review Panel from 2013 to 2018. Our second panelist is Commissioner Robert Eugenio T. Cadiz. Commissioner Cadiz was appointed to the Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines in 2015, where he now handles business and human rights, sustainable development goals, crisis and conflict, international humanitarian law, and peace. He also supervises the Human Rights Policy Advisory Office. Commissioner Cadiz chaired the Philippine Human Rights Commission's inquiry panel, which investigated the impact of climate change on human rights, which pioneered the conduct of a global inquiry process for NHRIs, where hearings were conducted by their commission beyond the territory of the Philippines. He advocates for the formation of inter-NHRI panels for the conduct of joint inquiries on issues imbued with transboundary elements and extraterritorial obligations. Our third panelist is Mr. Nadirev Yeb Madlasanyo. Mr. Sanyo served as commissioner of the Philippines Climate Change Commission, where he was vice minister and undersecretary, and which was the country's lead policy-making body in climate change from 2010 to 2015. While an undersecretary, he served as the Philippines' official representative and lead negotiator in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. In 2013, he served as the co-chair of the United Nations Climate Change Convention's long-term finance work program. And as a commissioner, he has been known as the champion for climate justice and has always been a strong voice for developing countries in the UN. After 5 years in public service, Mr. Sanya recently went back to civil society and now currently serves as the executive director of Greenpeace Southeast Asia. He leads the team that is confronting the biggest carbon polluters of the world in the landmark human rights case filed against top oil and coal companies at the Commission on Human Rights. And for our fourth panelist is Attorney Pocholo Labog. Attorney Labog is currently working as the Southeast Asia researcher and representative at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, where he engages and builds solidarity with a broad spectrum of stakeholders in the region to advance human rights in business. He previously served as the Legal Services Coordinator at the Legal Rights and Natural Resources Center and as a Program Officer of the Asia Foundation's Law and Human Rights Unit. Let us welcome our panelists in our moderated discussion. My first question is for Attorney Labog. Attorney Labog, what international frameworks can enhance the standards and practices of the private sector and ensure that the integrated approaches that corporations implement do not violate human rights and the rights of IPLC?
Thank you very much, Attorney Alex. First, I just want to say a big thank you to the UP Institute on International Legal Studies, Parabukas, for inviting me here to speak amongst the esteemed speakers and experts, and also to speak in front of students in this forum. So yeah, I learned a lot, especially on nature-based solutions. Yeah, so I'm here to discuss a little bit on, given the time that I'm allotted for me, on international frameworks that could enhance nature-based solutions. But before that, I just want to say also that it's great that we have intersections on conversations on climate and business and human rights, because with nature-based solutions, this is, I think, very necessary, because when we talk human rights, that includes the right to a balanced and healthful ecology or the environment. And this conversation will result to a more comprehensive discussion on human rights frameworks. And we cannot operate in silos, and the different frameworks need to be consistent and harmonized. The key takeaway for me is with nature-based solutions is the safeguards. And it's interesting that Attorney Attorney Jing also emphasized on this, that we need to have. It's great that we have nature-based solutions, but we need to also put a check on these solutions. And you hate to be the person criticizing solutions, because solutions are great. Hearing it in the flesh, the mangroves, the 9,000 hectare mangroves built in Vietnam. It's all of these are great solutions, but of course we need to also improve our solutions, and the only way is to check them as well and criticize them as well, and fully understand the concerns of groups like TEBDEBA and Third World Network on NBS, because I believe they're anchored in human rights, and their point of view is essential because they support groups that are impacted on the ground. So what are I would say these international frameworks that could enhance the discussion on nature-based solutions? Well, first, there's this very prominent in the business and human rights discussion. There's the UNGP, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, also known as the Ruggie Principles, which were developed by Professor John Ruggie. But these guidelines are voluntary guidelines, so that's just the limitation that we have. So they're soft law, and these guidelines have 3 pillars. It emphasizes the obligations of states to protect human rights. So this means requiring corporations, transnational corporations, to ensure that their actions do not violate human rights. The second pillar is the corporate responsibility to respect human rights. And the third pillar is the state and corporate responsibility to remedy human rights violations. So this framework encourages states to develop a national action plan on human rights as part of the state responsibility to implement these guiding principles. And we have a lot of national action plans in place already in developing countries, but again, the caveat here, it's voluntary. This is a voluntary mechanism. Another framework, and we advocated for this, especially when I was with LRC, and together with TEBDEBA Foundation and Third World Network, we pushed for this, the UN legally binding instrument on transnational corporations. So this instrument aims to it's still being negotiated in the UN on its 6th session, and it puts a regulatory framework to hold transnational corporations who are more often than not responsible for carbon emissions and violations to community rights of indigenous peoples and the environment. It puts a legally binding framework to hold transnational corporations accountable. So, like I mentioned, this is we're undergoing the 6th round of the negotiations, and this is supported by a lot of civil society organizations, particularly in developing countries. So I think whether you're part of the global campaign, so that's one of the groups that composed of civil society organizations that are pushing for the treaty, or the Treaty Alliance, which is a bigger group that is advocating for the treaty. And I've joined the Tebteba Foundation and Third World Network in pushing for this treaty. Um, so yeah, that's another framework that could enhance the this discussion, or the nature-based solutions should be incorporated or integrated in the discussions around holding transnational corporations into account. Um, I've said a lot already, and uh, but apart from these treaties, there's also the extraterritorial human rights obligations of states. Um, so even without the treaty, international recognizes that states have an extraterritorial obligation to hold um, their nationals into account if they violate human rights. Say, a corporation in a developed country like the U.S. or Canada, they conduct mining operations in a developing country like the Philippines. Um, Affected communities under international law have should have the capacity, if their rights are violated or the environment is destroyed, they should have the capacity to sue that corporation in their home state, um, and that's according to the active personality jurisdiction um, in international law. Um, yes, 2 minutes. Okay. Uh, and all of these frameworks also have spurred local legislation. Like for example, in France, they have the French duty of vigilance law, which uh, codif- codifies, or really expresses this extraterritorial human rights obligation. So if a French company violates human rights elsewhere outside their territory, the victims or the affected communities can sue, ideally under this law, um, the corporation in France. Uh, so so those are the international frameworks that are either being negotiated or are already in place. Um, so most of the international frameworks are voluntary. It's only the UN binding treaty on transnational corporations that is legally binding. And I hope we all sort of in the human rights business and human rights world, we all hope to have solutions that are anchored in human rights. And so we love this sort of discussions. So again, like I said, the frameworks are harmonized. Um, so thank you. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you, Attorney Labog, for that. For our second reactor, may we call on Professor Royal Gardner? And the question that I have for you, Professor, is that how does the Ramsar Convention support these integrated approaches, such as nature-based solutions and ecosystems-based adaptation? And does the convention specify safeguards and incentives for the implementation of these approaches?
Well, thanks so much, Attorney Alex, and many thanks to the dean and Rommel and Niner for the kind invitation to join you today, and thank you as well for your continued outstanding support of the Stetson International Environmental Moot Court Competition and the SEER, and for organizing this excellent program. So yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to sort of shift to the international policy framework. I've done a lot of work with Ramsar, and so that's where I feel most comfortable. But we already have heard wetlands mentioned a few times already, such as mangroves in a couple of presentations. And I want to note that it is Ramsar's 50th anniversary this year. It was signed in Ramsar, Iran on February 2nd, 1971. And so every February 2nd is World Wetland Day. And every World Wetlands Day, there was a theme. And in 2017, the theme focused on disaster risk reduction. In 2019, the focus was on a natural solution to climate change. And so to me, it is fascinating to see how a biodiversity related convention has evolved to include climate change and disaster risk reduction as part of nature-based solutions. So quick background for the students who may not be familiar with the Ramsar Convention. So as Professor Okano mentioned, this is a treaty that defines wetlands quite broadly to even include coral reefs. There are 171 countries that have joined the convention. And when they do join, they subscribe to three main obligations to designate wetlands of international importance. These are known as Ramsar sites, and there is a duty to conserve them. There is also an overall arching obligation of the wise use or sustainable use of wetlands within a country's territory, and international cooperation regarding transboundary resources, including species such as migratory waterfowl. And indeed, the primary focus initially was on wetlands as waterfowl habitat. As you can see, that's actually in the title of the convention itself. These words were actually added at the last minute in 1971 by a Soviet delegate. And that was because he wanted his ministry that dealt with forests and nature to deal with this convention, as opposed to it going over to another ministry, a ministry of water. And to some degree, we are still dealing with that legacy of siloing this convention from other ministries. And the implementation of the convention in early days had a nature or waterfowl focus. But over time, the convention has evolved and has begun to recognize the multiple values of wetlands, which include climate regulation and disaster risk reduction in terms of, just for example, and the flood storage capacity of wetlands, or to help mitigate storm surges. So as this evolved, we can see climate change making an appearance in the resolutions adopted at Ramsar conferences of the parties, which occur typically once every 3 years. And so initially, the COPs were adopting these resolutions as the IPCC was issuing its assessment reports. And these resolutions were talking about knowledge and awareness of the carbon sequestration and storage functions of wetlands, but it was general, and it was generally calling for protection and restoration of wetlands for these purposes. In later years, we've actually seen a shift now to resolutions that are providing more specific guidance with respect to particular types of wetlands, such as peatlands, which have been the subject of 3 resolutions, and coastal wetland systems such as salt marshes. Now, Ramsar typically operates on consensus, and the climate change resolutions can be quite controversial. So for example, in Changwon, Korea, when this was being negotiated in 2008, on the last day, they still hadn't reached consensus, so they brought it up and they put revision 3 up on the screens, which is madness. I mean, just imagine you've got 130 countries in a room and they are negotiating line by line. And so the chair of the conference actually told the folks who were interested in trying to work out an agreement to go out into the hallway to figure it out. And that's me in my blue shirt there. You see my back. We're negotiating with Brazil to try to find some language acceptable to Brazil. So they had substantive objections to dealing with climate change in this context because they're concerned about anything in an international document that might impinge on their ability to develop the Amazon. Now, why is there this antipathy in some quarters in the Ramsar Convention to embrace the issue of climate change, or at least address it. And that's because partly the history, and that Ramsar is viewed as a wetland, as a waterfowl treaty. And some countries don't want to expand its scope. They want Ramsar to stay in its lane. They argue that the expertise in climate change lies elsewhere, and with limited resources, focus should be on the core function of the convention and not on climate change. These objections were ultimately overcome, but they can illustrate the difficulty with trying to incorporate and promote nature-based solutions in this realm, and trying to break through the silos and have different ministries talk to each other. With respect to disaster risk reduction, it followed a similar trajectory in terms of moving from the general to the specific with resolutions. I do want to note that the Philippines actually submitted and sponsored the last two resolutions here in 2015 on wetlands and disaster risk reduction, and in 2018, the resolution dealing with intertidal wetlands, which stressed the need for nature-based solutions to restore these areas for disaster risk reduction. Now, these resolutions are meant to guide, to prompt, and to encourage national actions. Ultimately, it's up to the contracting parties to implement. And the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, have been mentioned. And so here, this gives us some indication about a willingness to adapt nature-based solutions. And we see in Southeast Asia, all the countries have at least mentioned some type of protection or restoration of wetlands, that is a nature-based solution, as part of their NDCs. Although, as Professor Okino noted, there are no measurable targets. A few other sources, if you're interested in this, so you might want to look at, would be the national reports that each country must submit prior to the Conference of the Parties. So from 2018, there was a reporting question that asked about enhancing policy with respect to wetlands for mitigating or adapting to climate change, and you see the results here. Sometimes merely to require answers helps prompt countries to take action. And similarly, another question was about identifying priority sites for restoration. Basically, this is nature-based solutions for disaster risk reduction and climate change. And again, there's some positive reports, but they can be built on and improved. And one point in this is that however, whenever these restoration projects move forward, you need the support of the local community, or ultimately it's not going to be successful in the long end. In some ways, the challenges of nature-based solutions, goes back to the Soviet delegate who inserted in the title, especially as waterfowl habitat. And so I think we need to break down the silos and try cross-sectoral, cross-ministerial approaches, such as some of those that were discussed here. And Ramsar is trying to promote nature-based solutions to bridge the divide with other sectors, to promote projects that are not only a win for biodiversity, but also for climate change and disaster risk reduction, which ultimately benefits people. But there's also money involved here. And Attorney Perea noted the Green Climate Fund. And if you can, there's not a lot of money just for wetlands as wetlands, but if you can link it to water security or disaster risk reduction or climate change, then funds may be available. And so one example is Uganda, which received a $24 million grant from the Green Climate Fund for wetland restoration. And so part of what needs to be done is to is to increase understanding of wetlands and their multiple values. And that's one of the reasons I always like to take my students out to a swamp, because the best way to appreciate the value of wetlands is actually to visit them. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the continued discussion.
Thank you, Professor Gardner. For our audience in Zoom, some questions in the Q&A tab have been answered by our resource persons if you want to read those discussions. My next question is for Commissioner Cadiz. Commissioner, can corporations be held accountable for the impacts of their operations on the environment and on human rights? How can that be done? And what would be the basis for that accountability?
Thank you very much, Attorney Alex Gamboa, and thank you also to the organizers of this event for inviting us. In answer to your first question, of course, corporations may be held liable for the negative impacts of their operations on the environment, on the climate system, and negative impacts on human rights as well. To say otherwise would be to guarantee the destruction of our environment, to bring us into the catastrophic consequences of global warming, and to put them above the law. I think the deeper issue that should be addressed right now is what should be the basis for holding corporations, specifically the carbon majors, accountable in the context of climate change. So before I directly answer that second question, let me put this issue into context. The operations of carbon majors insofar as extraction and sale of fossil fuel are concerned, extraction and sale. So right now, the reality is that the global economy is still largely dependent on fossil fuel. Although technology is already present in regard to renewable energy, and I refer to solar, wind, geothermal, even nuclear energy and all the renewable, other renewable energy, the technology is already there. Unfortunately, the scope of availability of these renewables are not yet there to sufficiently replace fossil fuel, such that if we hold that the sale of carbon fuel should be the basis of damages, and the logical consequence of that would be to say that therefore this sale of fossil fuel should be stopped. And if you follow that logic, given the lack of sufficient alternative at this point, at the scale that is required, this would be productive of negative impacts as well. Governments will close, schools will close, hospitals will close, because as I said, these institutions are still largely fueled by dirty carbon fuel. So the challenge right now is that confronts all of us is how to transition the global economy from dependence on fossil fuel and transition and graduate from that dependence through the use of clean energy. This is the challenge. And we say that all efforts to obstruct, to derail, to delay this transition is at the very least immoral. At most, they may be held illegal and unlawful and productive of damages. It is the obstruction and the obfuscation of the global effort to transition to clean energy that should be the basis of holding the carbon majors liable. And we have, in our report, we have found many, many acts and instances where these acts are present, have been committed, and therefore must give rise to legal accountability on the part of carbon majors. Earlier, it was discussed by the previous speakers regarding the legal regime that should put the carbon majors to account. There was reference to the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and to the international human rights law regime. So we recognize the fact that under the regime of universal human rights law, it is the states who are held primarily responsible for upholding human rights. It is their duty to protect. It is the duty of states to protect their citizens from human rights violations. And a major component or part of this responsibility is to enact laws to create a policy environment that would hasten, catalyze, quicken the transition of the global economy into clean energy. They should incentivize all efforts to promote, discover renewable energy, and especially disincentivize further fossil fuel production to hasten that transition. Incentives should be given to renewable energy research rather than further business as usual production and the sale of carbon fuel. So having said all this, that corporations are not held accountable under international law just because they are not parties to international law treaties does not mean that they no longer have a responsibility to uphold human rights, to preserve our environment, and to protect our climate system. There are many, many, many grounds for holding them accountable. For example, if they willfully obstruct, obfuscate climate science, to confuse the people, to confuse their investors, to confuse their shareholders, if they obstruct willfully the transition, if they withdraw, if they influence states, and if they, for example, through campaign finance, influence their states to withdraw, for example, from the Paris Agreement in the name of profit, then we hold that they can be held accountable for such bad faith, willful obstruction of efforts. If they are complicit with weak states in committing extrajudicial killings against legitimate community protests, for protests against, for example, laying of pipelines and further discovery of fossil fuel that would negatively impact their community, then they can be held accountable, legally liable for such acts. However, these acts at this point must be established under domestic laws and before municipal courts. Because as I said, there is yet no legal regime under international law in regard to climate change that will establish universal jurisdiction against the acts of corporations, or specifically in this case, the carbon majors. So let me go into another important point. Okay, I have 3 minutes that we would like to underscore. This is a very complex issue. It is very tempting and very convenient to say that the carbon majors be held accountable for the sale of carbon fuel, as I said earlier, and we caution our contribution to this global dialogue is for people to be circumspect in analyzing this issue, because if we fall into an ideological trap, the ideological trap of viewing this issue, such as an anti-capitalist stance, this will not be productive, because this issue is not just about dirty fuel being produced, admittedly. This is also and sold by multinational corporations, but this is also about people having no other choice, very little choice at this point. It is also about consumers availing of this dirty fuel. So to insist on an anti-capitalist ideological framework in viewing this issue might be counterproductive and confusing, and in the long term derail that transition. So there have been many aspects, many recommendations, suggestions by scientists and governance experts as to how this climate change and carbon may be sequestered. I think we believe that the governments should invest a lot of resources and create policies to mitigate the effects of this. But in the end, we believe that the real solution, the real perspective that should be adopted is towards that transition, and the real basis for holding carbon majors accountable should not be at this point for the sale of carbon fuel, but for their obstructive efforts, for their bad faith efforts in preventing quick transition in the name of profit. At this point, I would stop, and I'll be looking forward to the open forum later on.
Thank you, Commissioner Cadiz. Before we move on to the last question for this moderated discussion, a few announcements. We will be posting the link for the feedback form in the chat box for our participants. Please complete the form so the organizers can send the certificate of attendance. The recording of this webinar will also be accessible after the event through the Facebook pages of the UP Institute of International Legal Studies and Parabukas. Please also stay for a few minutes after the event so we can take a group photo. Moving on, for Mr. Yeb Sanyo, my question is, how does the principle of climate justice fit into frameworks on integrated approaches to address biodiversity, climate change, and sustainable development?
Thank you very much, Attorney Alex, and a pleasant day to everyone who have tuned in to this conversation. I echo the thanks for uh, UPILS and Parabukas for organizing. Um, and I also echo the appreciation for this integrated approach, this uh, recognition of the intersection that that we have in this conversation today, and hopefully to be reflected in the moot court competition discussions. Let's start with the obvious, and just to respond as well to that question on what does climate justice imply in terms of enhancing all of these frameworks, whether it's the climate regime or the biodiversity policy framework that we have internationally. The obvious had been quite significantly spotlighted by Commissioner Katis, in fact, but also, of course, by the main panel speakers earlier, Attorney Peria, Attorney Corpus, and Professor Okuno. And this is a matter of accountability, and in particular of a specific industry sector. And that accountability is key if we are to move forward. So let me just walk you through some of the things I wanted to highlight. So the nexus, the root causes, the implications, the way forward, and I would say in conclusion, but of course, the climate crisis will have profound, if not devastating, impacts on biodiversity. I think that is very clear to all of us. And anthropogenic climate change is the single biggest threat to biodiversity and the viability of natural ecosystems. But in fact, if we were to be a bit more specific or a bit more poetic, if you may, about it, climate change merely represents the most gargantuan of all habitat destruction. It is destroying the home of many species on a planetary scale, and it is the ultimate act of self-assured, self-inflicted harm by one single species, but in the process harming millions of other species. It is a self-defeating act that is unparalleled in human history. And already, what we now refer to as the climate emergency is adversely affecting high biodiversity areas and biodiversity hotspots, geographies with outstanding biodiversity, but also with the greatest threats to it, are ever more in peril. I'm not going to list down all of those factors, which has been um, mentioned already earlier. And in addition to the rapid decarbonization of the energy, industrial, and transport sectors, which some of the speakers have already emphasized, the emergency response to this situation must include a major investment in nature-based solutions that has been well emphasized. So in April of 2019, together with myself, together with good friends like George Monbiot, Greta Thunberg, Bill McKibben, David Suzuki, Naomi Klein, Margaret Atwood, Rowan Williams, and several other activists, we wrote a letter to the UNCBD, to the UNFCCC, to each government on this planet and to the civil society sector. And in that letter, we described the world as facing two existential crises developing with terrifying speed: the climate breakdown and the ecological breakdown. And neither of these two existential crises were being addressed with the urgency to prevent our life support systems from spiraling into collapse. Also, in that letter, we wrote to champion an important but neglected approach to averting climate chaos while defending the living world. This is nature-based solutions. And this means both drawing carbon dioxide out of the air by protecting and restoring ecosystems and also enhancing adaptation to climate impacts. So talking about justice, by defending, restoring, and reestablishing forests, peatlands, wetlands, mangroves, salt marshes, natural seabeds, coral reef ecosystems, very large amounts of carbon can in fact be removed from the air and stored. And at the same time, the protection and restoration of these systems can help minimize what we now consider as the sixth great extinction, while enhancing, of course, local people's resilience against climate disaster. So defending the living world and defending the climate are in many cases one and the same. So the root causes let's talk about the root causes. So climate and biodiversity are both social justice issues, and I will argue that in order to address both, and I say both because while we have distinct causality lenses in looking at the issue of climate change, slash climate justice and biodiversity decline, the roots of these twin crises are the same. And I would even venture to say that the roots of the coronavirus pandemic are also the same. So the roots of all of these crises are the same. It's the same system that has brought about the biggest planetary crisis in human history. And these problems, massive as they are all rooted in even more massive and systemic social and political issues. And maybe to touch on that question, all of these frameworks, all of these legal frameworks, all of these policy frameworks need to look at these problems at their root when they are rooted in these social and political issues, which of course includes the destruction of the original pre-colonial political economy and the devastation wrought on and the displacement of indigenous peoples, infinite growth economics, power dynamics, which include big government and corporate power, and dangerous mindsets that pervade a large number of people around the world. So what are the implications of this? It is becoming increasingly clear. No, it is unequivocally clear that humanity, largely through the disruption of the climate system, is leading us to the sixth major extinction event, which has been referred to as the Anthropocene extinction. It has also been described that this massive loss of genetic and species diversity, and I'm not exaggerating, will be the most important failure of humanity, one that future human generations will find very little reason to forgive our present generation. So what do we do in our way forward in pursuing justice and lasting solutions to the climate crisis and to the biodiversity crisis? All of these legal actions, all of these policy processes often fall short. But while they do often fall short, these processes and actions still form an important part of the tapestry of necessary responses. And legal actions, I would emphasize in the biodiversity arena, I've often focused on piecemeal issues. You will see, for example, cases such as who owns the patent to an ingredient derived from a plant species, or regulating harvesting of fish in a particular geography, or the use of nets that result in dangerous bycatch. We need these are important, but it's important for us to converge. The aspiration to avert this crisis can only be more likely to have any meaningful result if we were to consolidate legal action and policy responses to avert the climate emergency. To pursue climate justice is also to pursue ecological justice everywhere. And that reminds me of Martin Luther King Jr. He said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." So how do we address any kind of injustice? Is to fight for justice everywhere. So it is not really convenient that we're borrowing these words, but are invoking these words. I think it's really important that we understand the story of our situation. The story of climate justice is classic and simple. Those who are least responsible for the problem are the worst affected. It has a lot to do with how we are slaves of a dominant narrative. And I dare say that biodiversity crisis has the same story, but with varying inflection points in the course of human history. And in the scheme of things, the story is really about how settler colonialism, unfettered industrialization, and corporate greed have led us to where we are now. So nature-based solutions, I would agree with all of the presentations, all of the recommendations, including the caveats presented by Attorney Corpus earlier. But nature-based solutions represent a key to both climate adaptation and mitigation, and we cannot afford to go to what is deemed as false solutions. And this potential has been largely overlooked. Governments need to find ways to support this, and an urgent program of research, funding has been emphasized, and of course, political commitment. It is essential that we work with the guidance of free, prior, and informed consent for indigenous peoples and local communities, of course. So my last point here is, but of course, any approach to build resilience and give our ecosystems a fighting chance should not be used as a substitute for the imperative for rapid and comprehensive decarbonization of our economies. A committed and well-funded program to address all the causes of climate disruption, including natural-based solutions, will help us in holding the level of warming within manageable levels. And there is also the need for corporate accountability into response and policy frameworks. And biodiversity policy framework should strengthen those linkages with climate policy. And we are starting to see that, and must support climate justice objectives. Rights-based approaches to all kinds of climate and biodiversity solutions are also crucial, and social safeguards should always be part of the equation. Now, I will also want to highlight this point. Decolonialism and intersectionality is key in addressing the root causes. We need to reflect that, have that self-reflection as a species. And this is where I support much of the recommendations we've heard today. There really needs to be an integration of climate and biodiversity responses, both in policy, action, and all caps implementation. And the imperative for governments to reflect these solutions and approaches in the highest levels of their planning, especially in the nationally determined contributions. And on the legal side, climate litigation and litigation on habitat destruction should be also the focus of legal actions. Litigation and creative legal actions will continue to play an important role in exposing the cracks in the system, in naming the culprits, and in changing the way money works in this world. Ultimately, to achieve environmental justice, we must all recognize that the climate emergency and the biodiversity crisis threatens human survival, the environment, and the enjoyment of all human rights for present and for many, 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 many future generations. Let me end with a quote from my favorite story, The Lord of the Rings. So when Gandalf was explaining the ring to Frodo, and they were talking about the dreadful return of Sauron. I hope you remember these details in the story. Frodo expressed his worries and anxiety to Gandalf, and he said, "I wish it need not have happened in my time," said Frodo. And Gandalf responded, "So do I, and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All they have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us." I believe that among many, we have been given that time and legal action to defend the climate and biodiversity and ultimately to uphold human rights and the rights of indigenous peoples is a good use of the time that has been given us. Because we also want to remind ourselves the battle to ensure we leave a legacy of a thriving planet and the ability of the earth to nurture life in all its diversity. This battle will not be won or lost in plenary halls. They will be won or lost at the grassroots, maybe even literally at the grassroots. It is clear that the chambers of commerce will do very little to serve the interests of people and planet. But changing the way businesses do business is not only crucial from the legal and scientific standpoint, it is a moral imperative. Profit and power must be defeated in the sake of people and planet. And even if we do our best in the pursuit of environmental justice through legal actions, these battles will not be merely won or lost in the chambers of law. They will be won or lost in the chambers of people's hearts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sir Yab. Unfortunately, I have never watched The Lord of the Rings, but I will make sure I will after your reference, Sir Yab. Thank you so much to all our panelists for providing additional perspectives to everything we have heard from our speakers today. We will now move on to the open forum. We are unfortunately are constrained by time, so may I request from our resource persons to keep responses complete and concise. And we apologize if we are not able to ask all of the questions that have been asked in the robust discussions and the replies in the Facebook page and in the Facebook Live, as well as the Zoom. Our first question is from Zoom, and this is for Prof. Arian. How can we determine if a location requires more extensive intervention over others?
So I think there are a lot of variables and considerations that are going to go into site selection. It might be one that has an identified either current issue or historical challenge or problems such as erosion. That's often the case with the coastal projects. But there are a lot of other factors that go in. So what are the overall goals for the project? The biological, chemical, physical variables, environmental, technical, legal feasibility, site ownership. Those are just a few. Also, of course, it's important to include the local communities Indigenous peoples and other stakeholders throughout the process, including during the site selection process and project design. But often it's sites that have identified problems and there is funding, of course, for the project, and they've worked through the planning and have selected that site. But I don't know sort of the scientific technical details that go into it, but that's my general sense of some of the big picture factors that they consider. Thank you so much for the question.
Thank you, Professor Arian, for your answer. The next question comes from Facebook for Attorney Pinteria. Are any nature-based solutions being discussed when it comes to zoonotic diseases, taking a special focus at the CBD given COVID-19? And is there any new movement in this discussion?
Yeah, precisely last December 15 to 16, the CBD, the Substa and SBI had a special virtual session to discuss the implications of COVID-19. And yes, indeed, nature-based solutions are already mixed up in all these proposed solutions. And my work with the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity has led me to also help them scrutinize what are these kinds of possible solutions, because indeed there's a tendency to lump them all together, that this will all be like nature-based solutions. So the key, I think, is to be more discerning and then perhaps look at the ultimate objective of the initiative. Of course, right now we have this problem on recovering from the pandemic, and I think that's with the priority. And indeed, there are nature-based solutions that can very well consider that. But of course, again, it all boils down to where are the funding for this, because at the moment, the ASEAN has been discussing with its dialogue partners from Australia, Canada, Russia. They're all discussing post-pandemic initiatives, but so far it has not resulted to anything concrete. So hopefully these discussions will lead to more concrete, specific initiatives. But discussions are ongoing, and it can very well happen that nature-based solutions can be part of the solutions also, that it can be I hate to use the word catch all, that it will solve our problems, but at least this thing called multi-functionality, or perhaps multiple objectives, can be addressed by tackling nature-based solutions. So I'll stop there. I hope I have responded to your question.
Thank you, Attorney Ping, for that response. For the next question, a question coming from Zoom for Attorney Jing. How can communities get involved in nature-based solutions?
Well, it would be best if if the legal frameworks or the policy frameworks are in place that that make room for local community and indigenous involvement in nature-based projects that are considered nature-based solutions. So in the Philippines, we are fortunate because there is a requirement for stakeholder engagement, and if the project takes place within ancestral domains or indigenous territory, there is a requirement for free, prior, and informed consent. Now, if the projects are funded by the World Bank or by the Green Climate Fund, there's also a requirement there to engage the local communities. So in fact, in carrying out these projects, there should be, it's mandatory actually to involve communities. But well, communities in general, how would they be involved? Well, attentiveness, I guess. And being aware of what happens in your community. Well, if you know that a project is taking place, you can in fact approach the local government and ask to be involved, since these are requirements anyway in most laws and in most policies of funding agencies. Thanks.
Thank you, Attorney Jing, for the response. The next question is for Commissioner Cadiz. Can we bring legal actions to hold climate majors liable in the absence of climate liability legislation? And if so, what are the best legal bases for these?
Yes, of course, you can, I already essayed earlier the basis for holding these companies liable. And you do not need a climate specific law because the negative impacts, and by the way, most human rights that are negatively impacted are also covered by regular laws, such as violations, degradation of the environment. These are both essayed under regular laws and also are deemed as abuses against human rights. So you do not need a specific, as I earlier stated, there are already so many laws, domestic laws, that may be used as basis for holding these companies liable for acts that ultimately negatively impact human rights. What was the other question, Alex?
Sir, to repeat, can we bring legal actions to hold climate majors liable even without climate liability legislation?
Yes, I think I answered that. No? And for example, let me point out a very, very specific case. Some of our resource speakers might be familiar with the Kiobel case, which was a case in Nigeria where a carbon major corporation was sued in the U.S. And it involved a extrajudicial killing that was committed against community leaders by state agents, which agents were funded by that carbon major. The case was dismissed, but on a different ground. But under such a circumstance, they must be held accountable, not only within the framework of human rights as an abuse, but within the framework of regular law, which is murder. So there, and that was all in the context of discovering and distributing, extracting fossil fuel. So yes, but if you're talking about impact on the base, using as basis the sale itself, then again I go back to what we earlier found, that sale itself should not be a basis for holding accountable the carbon majors, just because right now the global economy still is dependent on fossil fuel.
Thank you so much for that response, Commissioner Cadiz. Unfortunately, we have run out of time for questions. But before we close, may I ask for a quick final point from all our resource persons? We can start with Professor Gardner.
Well, I would just like to say, to thank you for moderating, and also thank you for inviting me to participate. I look forward to seeing you all in person, and for the students, I wish you the best of luck with the upcoming competition. But also, if you are interested in this particular area, and I hope you are, that it is so important to work across boundaries. As a lawyer, you should be a translator. You should be able to translate the law to the scientists and the science to the lawyers. So best wishes, and take care.
Thank you, Professor Gardner. Attorney Labog.
Well, no additional further comments from me, but again, like to thank the UP Institute for International Legal Studies for inviting me, also the panelists and speakers for a robust discussion, and for allowing this type of forum of convergence of the climate discussion and human rights. Thank you, and to all the students, good luck.
Thank you, Attorney Labog. Mr. Yabsanyo.
Thank you, Attorney Alex. Just want to echo the thanks from everyone to the organizers for having us. Maybe as a last message, especially to the students who have joined us today, from our experience in our climate justice and liability work, community engagement is very crucial to change mindsets and behavior. I think that's what some of our colleagues today have been emphasizing, that it's not enough that we have legal action or policy formulation on one side. We also need to change mindsets, and irrespective of the outcome, we want to have change on the ground. Hence, we actively engage with communities while sustaining all of these efforts. And overall, what is important for us to remember is that any legal action, litigation, or even lobbying for policy is about more than obtaining judgment or policies. It is a larger process in which human rights law is just one tool towards the ultimate objective of lasting change. So thank you very much, and I wish all of you well, and for everyone to be in the best of health.
Thank you, Mr. Sanyo. Commissioner Cadiz, maybe call on you for a few last words.
Just a quick, because I noticed there was one question there regarding the how IP communities protest cannot be called ideological and anti-capitalist. I think that's an important question. My quick answer is that it is not ideological or anti-capitalist protest if the basis is the negative impact of the operation on for example, the environment, on the climate system, and on human rights. Then it is difficult, it would not be fair to say that such basis for protest is ideological, because clearly there's a direct degradation or negative impact on the environment. And for example, the absence of a impact assessment on human rights preceding their operations, these are not ideological. These are legitimate legal basis for protest.
Thank you, Commissioner Cadiz. Attorney Peria.
Thank you, and hopefully your participants have been able to look critically, at all the big picture, and of course the nitty-gritty aspects from the ground of nature-based solutions. And it's good that Attorney Cadiz tackled that thing about capitalist or not, but indeed there's no ideology about this, no? Well, perhaps the ideology is about the protection of the earth. So I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Attorney Ping. May we call on Professor Erin Okuno?
I'd just like to say thank you again to everyone for participating in this excellent event. Good luck to the teams. I look forward to seeing some of you during the final round later this week. And with respect to nature-based solutions, I think it's important to remember that although we've been doing this for a long time, we're in the early stages of thinking about nature-based solutions as nature-based solutions, particularly within the context of mitigation and adaptation for climate change impacts. And so there's still a lot of work to be done. And I hope that the students who are participating in this forum today, I hope that some of you will get engaged with this process, with these concepts and these ideas, so that you can help chart the future, help set the evidence base, find the data, find the solutions that we need. And to remember that these are not going to be all end all solutions. We're going to have to work across sectors and think holistically to achieve the targets and goals that we need to meet in order to ensure that we have a healthy planet for ourselves and for the future and for the environment. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. And lastly, Attorney Corpus.
Yes, thanks very much. And well, it's very difficult to come last, but I wanted to re-emphasize what most of the other speakers have said, that it's great that we're thinking about integrated solutions now. So we're thinking about bringing together experiences and solutions developed by the Climate Convention, by the Biodiversity Convention, by the Ramsar Convention, even human rights and the business and human rights. Um, but it's also important to look at these processes and strive for a race to the top and not a race to the bottom. So let's look at what has been done well by each of these processes, and let's try to replicate those as much as possible. And let's look at what has been not been done so well and try to eliminate those practices. And as uh, Commissioner Yeb, former Commissioner Yeb Sanyo has said, this is about winning hearts and minds. So let us always be mindful that about including the communities who actually live in the places where we are going to be carrying out these nature-based solutions, and involve them fully, because they do hold the solutions. So again, thanks to the organizers and good luck to the teams that are going to be competing. Thank you.
Thank you, Attorney Jing. And thank you so much to all our resource persons and to our audience for such a robust discussion. We apologize for running a little bit over time, but it has been truly an educational Monday morning. Thank you as well to the organizers, the UP Law Center Institute for International Legal Studies, and Parabukas for hosting this event. Some final reminders before we end this webinar. Please click on the link in the chat box for the feedback survey so you may receive your certificates of attendance. Please also stay for the panel photo. And lastly, to our SEER teams, please stay on Zoom until after the closing for your orientation. To close this event, may I call on the Director of Parabukas, Attorney Alaya De Leon, for her closing remarks.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Alex, for the introduction and for moderating today's program. What a pleasure it is to be part of this policy forum and learn from our esteemed speakers about such critical matters for people and the planet at the start of the year. The timing of the forum is extremely opportune amid the unprecedented challenges brought by the previous year. As we look forward to 2021 and seek to sustain momentum and, more importantly, increase efforts to address the various global crises we all face, which have been very well covered by our speakers and panelists. These crises, though, are not recent developments, but are the result of years, decades, and even centuries of human interventions on the Earth's natural systems and processes. And now we are tasked with trying to restore the balance and harmony of nature. And this forum is an important contribution to these discussions within the Philippines, in Southeast Asia, and internationally. So thank you so much for such a great event. We would like to extend our sincerest gratitude to our panelists, speakers, reactors for sharing their time and insights with us, as well as for being true champions for the climate, biodiversity, and rights. So it's not just theory with our speakers, but really we know that you are all championing all of these important issues in your work and daily lives. We also thank our participants for their enthusiastic engagement and genuine interest in the ideas exchanged during the forum. Thank you for all those who asked questions. We're sorry we could not respond to all of them, but we could see that you were really paying attention and really engaging with the ideas that have been exchanged. And of course, Alex has already mentioned, but we'd like to thank our forum organizers from both the UP Institute of International Legal Studies and Parabukas, who ensured the smooth coordination and facilitation of our virtual event, from the preparations to the day itself. And of course, after the event, there are more administrative things that will take place. So if you need your certificates and things like that, please follow the instructions that were mentioned by Alex earlier. And like what everyone has already mentioned, I'd like to wish a good luck to the SEER participants in the next few days of competition. Hopefully, this forum has energized you and given you inspiration to do your best in the coming days. And once again, a good day to everyone, and we hope to see you again maybe next year, hopefully, for the third Biodiversity and Climate Change Policy Forum. Thank you.
Thank you, Aya. And with that, may I request everyone to turn on their videos, their cameras, so that we may take our group photo.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'll be taking the picture. Attorney Pink, can you please turn on your camera? Okay. All right. Okay. Let's just get ready. Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Okay, another one. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great week ahead and good luck to all our competitors. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Roy. Thanks,
All right, thank you.
thanks, Attorney Ping.
Thank you so much.
Okay.